Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another tutorial. This tutorial is going to be a little bit different from the ones that I've been working on recently. This is going to deal with music, but hopefully this will be the beginning of a crossover series. It's dealing with not only Linux music or music on open source music software, but also music in relationship to video. So we're going to try to make a short film using some techniques in Blender, which is something I'm sure some of you have been looking for. If you follow my channel, you've probably been missing some of these Blender tutorials. We're going to be doing some more of those, but we're going to try to incorporate that with some of these music tutorials as well. And we're gonna try to start at the very beginning of an animation project, a movie project, just a little short kind of animation in which we're going to be adding some music. And we're going to focus not really on storytelling or characterizations or anything like that, but mostly on establishing shots and wide vista kind of images, and creating a montage of these ideas visually, and then putting some music to that. Now this is going to be a tutorial series for people, particularly on the music side, who may not know really anything about music, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment here. You don't really need to be a musician to create music for, particularly for visual art, for video art, creating a film score. Now you will need to know a little bit about the software that we're going to be using. You need to know the general principles behind a digital audio workstation, and certainly you're going to need to know a little bit about animation software and about Blender specifically. We're not going to be starting at the base level with regard to using the software, but we will be at the base level. With respect to creating music to go with that imagery. So first of all, I just wanted to have a short discussion in opening up this project here. First, talking about some of the things that you need. What do you need in terms of your software or hardware? In general, in order to make music for film, you really only need some kind of audio recorder. That's really all you need. So just some kind of audio recording and audio editing software. So with respect to open source, there's really nothing that beats Audacity. That's a pretty widely known, widely used audio editor. So if you take a step up from there, you would want to use some sort of a digital audio workstation that does multi-track kinds of mixing. So we've been using LMMS, another really well-known one. We may not use it, but actually it works very well for video, would be Ardour. Ardour is a great piece of software. The only limitation is that for the kind of free version that you can use without paying, a fee, after about 10 minutes or so, it can go silent, and it's fine because you can save your projects and you just reopen up your project again, and you're back to where you need to be. Ardour is very, very powerful, and it's gotten very, very functional in recent years. When it's functioning fully, it resembles really any professional grade digital audio workstation with respect to what it can do in recording and editing audio, and also using MIDI instrumentation and doing orchestration with sampled sounds. There's some limitations on what instruments you can use and what samples you can use, what format, but assuming that you want to use synthesizers, there's plenty of synthesizers available for it. If you want to do mock-ups, certainly it does the sound font format for sampled sounds. So Ardour is very, very capable. It also has the ability to sync to video, so you can play a video back, not directly in the software, although the software will launch an external application to play video. So it's very, very powerful with that respect. In fact, the latest versions, I should say, really play on that. Some of the catchphrases have to do with music for film. We're not going to be using Ardora, although we may take a quick look at that on a few occasions. Linux Multimedia Studio, LMMS, I have to get used to that. It's not Linux Multimedia Studio anymore. That was never really a good name for it, but LMMS is extremely powerful as a MIDI sequencer. It is not powerful as an audio editor, but honestly, when you're creating film music, you're not usually working with audio specifically, especially if you're doing mock-ups. Usually you're working with MIDI instrumentation. Now, it does do audio sequencing. It just does not do audio editing, and for that we could use an external audio editor very easily. So that's probably what we're going to be doing. LMMS also does not do video syncing. That doesn't really matter, though. You don't need to have a digital audio workstation that does video syncing. All you need to do is to be able to count and do math. Okay, so back in the day, 15, 20 years ago when I was doing this in college, I didn't have a video capable digital audio workstation, and I was fine by that. In fact, I was writing my music in notation software using mathematical principles to understand in the time code where I needed my hits to happen, and that's the way it used to be done all the time. So some of the most expressive film scores in the history of film were created in a time when other mathematical techniques were being used. Now, there is a bit of a quick and dirty benefit to being able to score directly into a digital audio workstation that's playing video back and being able to capture your MIDI data from a keyboard kind of on the fly and in real time. But it isn't necessary, and I think there may even be a sense in which when you record that way, if that's the only way that you're recording your film score, that it may suffer, I think, with some respects, and that you haven't taken the time to really think about what's going to be happening. You're kind of in the moment and doing things real time, and you're more or less stuck with what you have. And you can go back and edit, but that's up for debate, I think, whether or not that's a wonderful benefit or whether it's just kind of a little benefit. So we're going to be working mostly in LMMS, doing some mathematical principles. The third thing that I would point to that you may want to have, especially if you're going to be using a digital audio workstation separate from a video editor, is you'll need a video editor. So for that, we're going to be using Blender. Now, I have kind of preset a template that is an AV template that uses the video sequence editor, and as we are incorporating music or extracting video data for our music, we're going to be using the video sequence editor to do that, and we'll be talking about ways to do it. The last thing, the fourth thing that you may or may not want to use is a notation software suite, such as MuseScore, or there are other proprietary ones that are well known like Finale, Sibelius, or Notion. You don't need to do this. In fact, most people who are creating film scores do not use notation software unless they're going to be creating music that needs to be transcribed out for musicians to play in a real soundstage recording kind of environment. So when I was, again, younger than I am now, and I was doing this with student project films and graduate school films, I was using notation software, but that's because I was a classically trained musician, and that's kind of what I knew. So I would write my scores out as if they were being made for someone to play, whether they were or not, and then I would extract my MIDI data from that. So we may look at that a little bit and examine some of those techniques. So in terms of what you need a digital audio workstation. You may only need that, as well as some ability to mix that together in a video editor. You probably will need an audio editor if you really want to work on some mastering when you're done with your sequence, or for the incorporation of specific sound samples that need to be edited. You'll want an AV editor to mix everything together, and music notation program is optional if you work that way. In addition to all of that, you'll need some sound samples and some synthesizers, one or the other or both, and we'll talk about that as we run into that. There are plenty of open source and free alternatives that we've already looked at on this channel. We'll be visiting those again. And of course, the last thing is you need a film. So that will be part of the other portion of this crossover tutorial series, where we'll be looking at the creation of a short film and looking at some of those creative OpenGL rendering ideas that we are popular for on this channel. So be on the lookout for those tutorials as they come up and the way that they'll cross over into this series. The last thing that you're going to need is not a software issue. It has to do with musical vocabulary. You're going to need to have some kind of musical vocabulary that you can pull from that will help you write your music. Now, assuming that you know nothing, let me go over some very basic vocabulary issues that you may want to consider. I have a MIDI keyboard hooked up here using a Yamaha Clavinova full-size keyboard as my MIDI entry device, and we're on a piano sound font here, and you can see my key depressions down here. Very basically, if you know nothing about music, you may not even have a MIDI keyboard for entry. That's okay. You do need to understand a little bit about key placement and kind of some basic theoretical principles. And I'm going to spend this tutorial talking a little bit about that right now. So this is not, I want to be clear here. There are a number of tutorials out there that propose to teach you tricks or shortcuts. What I'm going to show you, these are not tricks and shortcuts. This is real music theory. This is just basic music theory. It doesn't teach you everything about the tangential kind of ideas that touch these basic elements of music theory, but this is real music theory. This is stuff you can take to the bank. So if you know nothing, you can follow along here. If you know something about music theory and you already have a vocabulary, you can probably just turn this tutorial off right now. Otherwise, just follow along for the fun of it and see what we have to say here. But these aren't tricks. These are not tricks. This is the real stuff, and I want to share it with you. So if you pay close attention, you might learn something here. First of all, as you're looking at the keyboard, you can see here that we have a repeating pattern on these black keys of 3 space 2 space 3 space 2 space. These represents what may be called the sharps and the flats in your keyboard. So there are 12 total notes in music theory. 8 of them, I should say 7 of them, and the 8th one is a repetition of the very first note. They make up a scale. Some sort of traditional Western music scale. There's lots of different traditional Western music scales. 2 scales that we usually deal with. One of them is major, one of them is minor. But those 7 keys, or 8 keys if you count the repeating note on the top, make up that scale. And the black keys fall in between. These are the sharps and flats. They alter those notes by half steps, either up or down. If we're just looking at the white keys here, we can have a scale, a major scale that begins on C and ends on C. Now it's already labeled right here inside of this instrument by numbers, C4, C5, C6. C4, this one right here, is middle C on the keyboard. Okay, now if I go from C, which happens to be the white key to the left of the 2 black keys in that repeating pattern. And you can see that if you take the white key to the left of the 2 black keys anywhere, it's always going to be a C. These are just different C's on this pattern. If we start on that C and we go up on the white keys, C, and in alphabetical order, C comes D next, E is next. Again, this is alphabetical order. F is next. G comes next, and then we run into a cyclical kind of situation here where we're going to start over again at the beginning with A. So once you get to G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, it starts over again at A. The next note is A, B, and then C. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. This is a major scale. This is a major scale in the key of C. Now, you don't have to know much about any of the other key signatures or the other keys that you'd be working in, because we're using software and we can transpose. We can select the things that we write in that major key, that major scale, and we can move them around and transpose them into various other keys. We'll talk about that more as we go along in the process here on other tutorials. But really, you can start with a very basic vocabulary that's in one key. And because we have the benefit of software, we can then transpose things around. So major scale, C to C, everything in between. We can also play a minor scale if we go to the A. So let's go down from C, B, A. If we start on A, which is this key right here between the three black keys, it's between the 2 on the top in that repeating pattern of 3, that's A. If we start on A, we go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. This is a minor scale. These are the two kind of prominent scales that you would be writing Western music in, a major scale and a minor scale. Now, these are in different keys. This would be A minor, and this would be C major. Now, if you were to take the sequence of events from the A minor scale, that is that there is a whole step, and then a half step. You see there's no black key between these two notes. So a whole step, a half step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. And if you were to apply that to the key of C, we would go from the first note to a whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, then another whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, and then another whole step at the top. You would have a minor scale that's transposed in the key of C. Now remember, you can write in the key of A minor, and then we can digitally transpose, electronically transpose that into any key that we want. So again, just using the white keys, you have major key and a minor key, just by moving where we're starting. Okay. Now, there are a bunch of other modes. So another part of your music vocabulary here is that you can actually start on any one of these notes. And if you start on any one of those notes and go to the next instance of it, you have another type of scale. And these are different modes. And we're not going to talk about what the modes are. It doesn't really matter at this point. You don't even have to know what they are. But you can know that that is a truth. For example, if I start down here on G. Okay, so this is a G, C, B, A, G. If I go from G to G, I have a different mode. Has kind of an exotic sort of sound to it, but this could be my tonal center, and I could have chords based on that tonal center in this sequence of events, and that would be a modal scale that is not major or minor. It kind of has attributes of each of those at different places. I can do this with any one of the white keys starting as a starting point. If I start on D, for example, and I go from D to D, it has a very minor kind of flavor to it, but not every part of it fits perfectly into the minor mode, okay, from D to D. So this has a particular name. It's called the Dorian mode. You don't need to remember that, but it is another way that you can write. So we have three things. We've got a major key, C to C. We have a minor key, A to A. And then we have the possibility of any other mode starting in any other place. Okay. The next thing I want to point out is the concept of chords. So chords are any three notes being played simultaneously. That's the basic definition. Literally any three notes. I could have this note here, an A. I could have this note here, which is a D, and I could have this note here, which is a G. Now, theoretically, this is a certain kind of harmony, but this is a chord. Okay, that's a chord. Any three notes being played simultaneously represents a chord. Now, there are more traditional Western harmonies, Western chords that we want to be aware of, and in general, you can name the chord after the starting pitch of the scale that you're using. So let's say we're in the major key, C major here, and we have a chord that goes every other white key starting on that first note on the C. This would be a 1 chord because it starts on the first note of the scale. This would be a 2 chord. Now it has a certain quality to it. We don't need to worry about that right now, but this would be a 2 chord in that key, in that modal center. This would be the 3 chord. Again, we're going every other white key starting on the third note of the scale. This would be a 4 chord. This would be a 5. This would be a 6. This would be a 7. And then this would be the 1 again, because we started over again at the very top of the scale. We go back to 1. Again, 7 notes in the scale, and then the 8th repeats at the top. So 1 chord, 2 chord, 3 chord, 4 chord, 5 chord, 6 chord, 7 chord, back to a 1 chord. Okay, so these are all what we call tertiary chords, or based on thirds. Okay. We're not going to talk about the qualities right now. Just know that they're there. Now, you can progress from chord to chord, and the common way, the Western way that this is done, without understanding chord flow charts, and there are certainly things out there for that. Let's say you know nothing. You could know that the most common way to go from chord to chord is to have the chords related by some sort of common tone. It could be 2 or 1 of the tones from one chord are also in the other chord. For example, I could have a 1 chord is related by 2 notes to the 3 chord. See how that works? Which by 2 notes is related to the 6 chord, or sorry, the 5 chord. So you have the 1 chord, 3 chord, 5 chord. These are all related. They overlap by 2 notes as we go along, which would also be related to the 7 chord. And you can see when I get to the 7 chord, I'm actually far away. There are no related tones to the 1 chord. Okay, so that's a common sort of movement. You can play around with this concept of sharing notes. You could also have chords that are related by only 1 tone. This is the 1 chord, and let's say we go up now to the 5 chord. It's related by 1 tone. And then we can go up from there to the 2 chord. So the 2 chord, we'll move it down here, is related to the 5 chord, because this note up here is the root, or the bass note, or the beginning note of the 2 chord. If we move it down the octave. Okay? So you can choose what your chordal movement is going to be based on how many notes are related. You don't always have to do that. You can certainly play 2 chords that have no relationship, but usually in the terms with respect to fluidity of movement, we want to have some of those notes related. That makes it a little bit easier to move from one note to the next, or from one chord to the next. Now what we're doing here is we're shifting our triad, or our chord based on thirds, up such that the notes are always kind of in the same order. There's 1 third and then another third. Now you can do what we call invert these chords to make it fit a little bit better. For example, I can go from a 1 chord, which is C, E, G, the third, skipping every other note, and I can go to a 4 chord, which would be starting on this note here. But if I take that top note and I move it to the bottom, it's actually shared with the 1 chord. Here's the 1 chord, and if I just maintain that shared note and move up the other 2 notes, I have a 4 chord that is what we call inverted. And you can see that this voice did not have to move. 1 chord, 4 chord, 1 chord. I could do the same thing where I take the 2 notes in the bottom and move them down. And you see what I end up with is actually these notes. I have B, D, and G. And if I were to stack these up so it's third by third, it would be G, B, and D up here. But I'm taking these 2 notes and I'm moving them down to here, and now it's inverted. This is a 5 chord because the G, B, and D is based on the 5th note of the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 chords. So I have a 5 chord down here by shifting down the bottom 2 notes and keeping my shared note in the top. So I have a 1 chord, a 4 chord, a 1 chord, a 5 chord, and then a 1 chord. And just from that basic understanding of harmony and chord movement and those 3 major chords, I could write a piece of music just based on that motion. I could have a couple measures of this, a chord quality, a couple measures of that chord quality. I could go right down to the 5 chord or back to the 1, a couple measures, and then come back to where I started at. Typically, you're going to want to kind of resolve back to your 1, whatever key it is. Now we could apply the same kind of principle to the minor key. If we go down to the A, this is the tonal center now. Okay, so in A minor, I have a 1 chord, 4 chord, 1 chord. This is a 5 chord. You'll notice that it doesn't sound quite right. There's a reason for that. And then a 1 chord. Now you can use that. Normally we change one of the notes in there to make it a different quality, but we're not going to get into that right now. You could write music on this in a minor key, 1 chord, 4 chord, 1 chord, 5 chord, 1. It doesn't have the most pleasant end to it, going 5 to 1 this way, but you could do it. It would work. You could do this anywhere else in any other mode. Let's say we go to the D. So this is the what we call the Dorian mode. Again, you don't need to know this, but we could say we start on this, and we could do the same kind of idea. 1 chord, 4 chord, 1 chord, 5 chord, 1 chord. Okay, it lacks the complete resolution that we get in the major key, but you could do it. Now there's some sense in which I don't even need to know that much. If I start on the 1 chord in this Dorian mode and I go to that 4, this sounds pretty good already. So I can just keep the bass note down here on that D. Have sort of a jazzy sort of feel to that, and I'm just using the white keys here in a different mode. So again, I can compose in a modality without using any of these sharps and flats, and then I can transpose that into whatever I want. So for example, I might write a segment that is in this C major kind of situation. Write a portion of music in that, and then I could shift to my Dorian mode, which is a different starting point. And then what I can do is I can transpose that material that I write down 1 step, and then I can put that together with things that I've already written, and then I start to have some sort of a flavor going on there. I start to get some chromatic movement, and I'm adding in sharps and flats, but I didn't really have to conceive of it in any kind of special way. So a couple of ideas there for you. Again, these aren't really tricks. These are not really tricks. This really is music theory, very, very basic rudimentary elements. And if you're a beginner, you can do some pretty advanced sounding things just with some very basic principles. So I would encourage you to take a piece of software like this. Just so you know, Linux Multimedia Studio, LMMS, pardon me, uses the keyboard also as a keyboard. So for example, as I'm looking at my QWERTY keyboard, let's see, find a note here. C4 is Q. Q is C4, W is the D, E is E. That's nice. F is R, G is the T, A is Y, and then the U is the B, and then I is the octave. And then up above that, if you wanted to, the numbers sit in for the accidentals up here, the sharps and flats. So you can use actually your QWERTY keyboard, put your fingers on there and play directly in. So I would invite you to, this is on my QWERTY keyboard right now, I would invite you to play around with some different ideas. Now I notice that there's some issues with polyphony here. It only wants to play a couple notes at a time. But you could play around on your QWERTY keyboard if you don't have a MIDI entry device with some sonorities and get some ideas there and write them down and keep kind of a log of that. So that's what I wanted to show you now, a few things to get you started just in thinking about writing music and playing around with some different sonorities. As we go through this process, we will talk more in depth about how to get particular types of moods using some of this basic information, and of course we'll talk a little bit more advanced as we go along. So things that you need a digital audio workstation. It'd be good to have an audio editor as well. Be good to have a notation program if you have the vocabulary for that and you're interested in writing in score form and you need to create something for other people to play. You also need an AV editor. We're going to be using Blender, but of course you could use anything that can sync together your music and your audio with the video that you're working with. And of course you're going to need some instrumentation. You'll need some plugins or some sampled sounds as we go along. And then of course vocabulary, which we've been discussing here. Some basic music principles to start with. So take this, experiment around with it. I'll see you in the next episode. I don't know when that's going to happen. I make no guarantees or warranties about it, but I'm going to try my hardest to get a series going here where we start applying some music composition from the bare bones, from the bass line, into some video projects. So good luck with these little pieces of information and happy experimenting, and I'll see you at the next tutorial.